Today, the roads, streets and lanes of this busy town in Nottinghamshire, England, are filled with people going about their everyday lives. They would probably find the notion of open warfare on their doorsteps faintly ridiculous, even absurd. These days, it is more likely to be traffic and tourists that disturb their peace. In the middle of the 17th century, however, life was very different in this town. It was an important theatre of a bitter war, a war that set father against son and brother against brother. This was the English Civil War, and it came to this place with a vengeance. Newark, 1643 to 46. Charles I ascended the throne of England in March 1625, and almost from the word go, he fell out with his parliaments. The disagreements were mainly about money and war, but at the heart of the argument was Charles's unshakable belief in his divine right to rule. In fact, Charles hated parliaments, and they, for their part, increasingly came to realize that the monarch would bend to their will only if he was forced to. By the early 1640s, Parliament was determined to win real power, and the king was equally resolved that they should never have it. The simmering row finally boiled over late in the year 1642, when England erupted into civil war. A war that would claim thousands of lives and would eventually lead to the execution of the king himself. Throughout the bitter conflict that followed, the armies of both sides attempted to capture strategically vital towns and cities. One such town was Newark, which is situated at an intersection of road and river in the Midlands of England. It was called the Key to the North, a region of the country that was one of the war's key battlegrounds, and the Royalist and Parliamentarian armies each wanted it so badly that it became the scene of no fewer than 3 separate sieges during the Civil War. Armies fought and troops died there, while the ordinary townspeople were forced to endure those other great dangers to life, hunger and disease. Even today, more than 350 years on, the town still bears the scars.
Well, Newark, of course, has always been strategically important. That's why the Romans had a major garrison here. That's why we have a castle here from medieval times. The Great North Road came through the town of Newark, and the River Trent was fordable at this point. Therefore, really, the Trent marks the sort of north-south divide between parliamentarians and royalists, and whoever held Newark in the East Midlands held the key not just to the heart of the Midlands, but also, of course, to the ports on the East Coast, which were crucial for the logistic support, particularly of the royalists.
The ruins of Newark Castle cast their shadow across the River Trent. The Queen's Sconce, the best preserved of the surviving Civil War defensive earthworks, looks balefully over the town. Buildings that were the centerpiece of the town's stubborn resistance still defy the passing years. Newark lies at the very heart of England, in the county of Nottinghamshire, close to the cities of Nottingham and Lincoln. The town is fiercely proud of its English Civil War heritage, for the fact is that despite all the hardships and privations endured by its citizens during the English Civil War, they only surrendered to their enemies when they were finally ordered to do so by King Charles himself. For since 1642, Newark had been a royalist stronghold, and the parliamentarians were determined to get their hands on it.
Newark was, I think, more by accident of who owned the land and where the fiefdoms were from the Middle Ages. Newark was staunchly loyalist. It also contained, of course, a large number of troops who had had some experience in the Low Countries. And it was a natural focal point for the East Midlands. It had a strong-ish garrison, it had strong-ish defences, and it was strategically important.
Like the armies of any age, the opposing sides of the English Civil War were more used to the wide open spaces of a battlefield, where men would stand and fight toe-to-toe, where commanders would command, where the perceived rules of warfare applied, and where a victory, if it could be won, was achievable in a relatively short space of time. Siege warfare was a very different business. It was often laborious, slow work, but for a besieging army, not without its attractions. Whereas pitched battles were notoriously unpredictable, a besieging force held the initiative at all times, and success was all but guaranteed, providing it was patient.
Siege warfare is as old as warfare itself. The idea was to surround the town and to starve it into submission in some way. The outside forces had the initiative all the time. Pitched battles are very unpredictable, and the fact that you were the biggest group didn't necessarily mean that you would win. So sieges were in fact more popular with the military for that reason, that it was almost guaranteed success providing you could sit there long enough.
At Newark, the parliamentarians would try to seize the town by all manner of means, while the royalists employed every trick they knew to keep them out. By early 1643, the people of Newark, and Sir John Henderson, its first governor, knew that a parliamentarian attack was a certainty. Henderson's first act as governor had been to order the construction of a new circuit of earthwork defences and ditches beyond the old medieval town walls. Henderson had certainly made good use of his experience with armies on the continent, where he had first seen these types of earthwork defences. It was on the 27th of February that a parliamentary force commanded by Major General Thomas Ballard marched towards Newark from nearby Beacon Hill. The first, albeit brief, siege of Newark was shortly to begin, and Henderson's defences were about to be put to the test. "6,000 parliamentarian soldiers, divided into 3 brigades, made the first attack on Newark. The first of these was an artillery brigade, and it was these men that poured cannon fire into the town. The other 2 brigades attacked at the earthwork defences and at the North Gate area of the town. Believing that victory was assured, Ballard invited Henderson to surrender the town. Henderson refused. But the parliamentarian troops were simply unable to make any headway into Newark itself. Henderson's defences did their job, and he had positioned his own troops astutely. The fighting wore on, and unable to achieve a decisive breakthrough, the parliamentarians became dispirited and tired. Realizing that they were losing the initiative, Henderson chose his moment to order a counterattack that not only drove the parliamentarians back, but also saw the royalists capture 60 of Ballard's men and 3 of his cannon. What had seemed a certain parliamentarian victory had been turned into humiliating defeat. It was an unexpected and sobering reverse for the parliamentarians and for Ballard, who, after a couple of days spent agonizing outside the defences of the town, decided that he wasn't getting anywhere and that he wasn't very likely to. He abandoned the first siege of Newark. Victory for the royalist stronghold came at a cost, though. During that first short siege of Newark, the parliamentarian cannon fire had caused a great deal of death and injury. Here, for example, at the Old White Hart, an historic coaching inn, a mortar shell hit the rear of the building, and as a result, many citizens of Newark lost their lives. For the remainder of 1643, the 2 sides jockeyed for position in a series of engagements around the country. It would have been possible for the royalists and parliamentarians to reach a negotiated peace, were it not for the stubborn refusal of King Charles to compromise and the determination of the hawkish elements within the parliamentarian ranks to fight the war to the bitter end. With no prospect of a negotiated settlement to the war, England was suffering. The Scottish Commissioner, Robert Bailey, wrote in a letter home that the country is in a most pitiful state, with no corner of it free from the evils of a cruel war. Every shire, every city, many families are divided in this quarrel, and much blood and universal spoil are made where they prevail. The town of Newark is unlikely to have been any different. In June 1643, King Charles's wife, Queen Henrietta Maria, made a visit to Newark during her journey from Hull to the king's headquarters at Oxford. She had been visiting the continent to try and raise troops for the royalist cause, and she is reputed to have stayed here, at this house on the Kirkgate area of the town, which then belonged to Lady Frances Leake, wife of Colonel Charles Leake, a royalist commander. In the same month of the same year, the royalists won a victory at Adwalton Moor, a triumph that gave them control of much of the north of the country. Victories at Lansdowne and Roundway Down followed, and Bristol was also captured, putting the royalists in a position of real strength in the west. Sadly for the king, this was to be the extent of his good fortune. Matters were never to get better than this for him. In fact, from September 1643 onward, they took a distinct turn for the worse. It was then that Parliament signed the Solemn League and Covenant with the Scots, bringing their army into the war on the parliamentary side. The entry of the Scots into the war was to have grave consequences for Newark. To meet this new threat, royalist units from the Midlands were dispatched north to bolster the forces of the Marquis of Newcastle, the royalist commander entrusted with the job of stopping the Scots' advance along the east coast. Several of these units came from Newark, which in truth could ill afford the losses. By now the town had a new governor. The king had decided to replace Sir John Henderson with Sir Richard Byron.
Henderson had been a very successful defensive commander, and part of his tactic, of course, was to move out offensively. There were three royalist sallies, if you like, against the parliamentarian stronghold in Nottingham, which, we're talking about now the autumn of 1643, that whilst they were successful manoeuvres, tended to leave Newark uncovered, and the garrison therefore was adrift, doing other things elsewhere. On the 11th of October 1643, Henderson was defeated at a place called Winsby, just up by Horncastle, so actually inside Lincolnshire. And that allowed the rest of the parliamentarians to come up north, up towards Gainsborough, and continue their sort of enveloping movement round to the east through Lincolnshire up to the north of Lincolnshire. This actually left Newark really quite dangerously isolated, and of course led on to eventually the successful prosecution.
So the Newark garrison had been weakened by the siphoning of troops to fight in the north, while parliamentarian strength had grown in Lincolnshire. It was hardly surprising then that Byron pleaded with the royalist army for urgent reinforcements. His pleas fell on deaf ears. A local man from Strelly in Nottinghamshire, Byron was an experienced military commander, and his worst fears were confirmed in late February 1644, when an army of some 7,000 parliamentarian troops appeared outside the town. Newark was now facing the distinctly unpleasant prospect of a second siege. In addition to 7,000 troops, of which 2,000 were cavalrymen, the parliamentarians had at their disposal 11 cannon and 2 mortars, and on the 29th of February, shots from these began to rain down on the town. On the 11th of March, the home of Alderman Hercules Clay, the mayor of Newark, was destroyed by the bombardment. The colourful story of how he dreamed that his house would be demolished and had moved out as a result has become part of Newark's rich folklore.
Hercules Clay was a mercer. He was the son of a mercer, so he did rather well. He wasn't a Newark man, but he'd moved into town and he'd made his money. He bought a house at the corner of the marketplace, which was just opposite the governor's house, and it is thought that Hercules Clay's house was a similar sort of building. And one evening during 1644, he had a dream. He dreamt that his house was bombarded, was hit by cannon fire, caught fire, and all in perished. But when he'd had the dream twice, he then decided it was time to act. So he moved all his family and servants out of the house, and lo and behold, the house was hit.
Like most people of the age, Hercules Clay was a deeply religious man, and he saw his deliverance as a divine favour that he was determined to repay. On the 11th of March 1644, it pleased Almighty God in his infinite mercy wonderfully to preserve me and my wife from a fearful destruction from a terrible blow, wrote Clay.
He left a sum of money, £200, £100 for the church, for them to conduct a service on the nearest Sunday to the 11th of March, when the attack occurred, and £100 for the poor. But it's thought that the £100 for the poor actually was snapped up by the Royalist cause immediately after he donated it. That service, by the way, still continues today.
This hole in the spire of Newark's Mary Magdalene Church also bears mute witness to the great intensity of the parliamentarian bombardment during that second siege. By the first week of March 1643, parliamentarian troops were also making headway in their attacks on the town. One important parliamentarian gain was the capture of the island, an area in the River Trent to the northwest of Newark, where the river divides into two channels. It was here, on the 6th of March, that a troop of Royalist horse and a regiment of infantry commanded by Colonel Gervase Hollis were overwhelmed by the parliamentarian forces.
It was GTI, ground of tactical importance. If you held the island, then you would hold the ford, the crucial ford up at Muscombe, and you would also put your guns in such a place that you could bring particularly your howitzers and your mortars to bear on the centre of the town. There's no real high ground here, other than Beacon Hill. There's no real high ground around Newark. And not only could you hold the ford, but you could, in due course, affect the flow of the river, or the canal rather, that came in through town and allowed the mill wheels to turn. The mill wheels, of course, ground flour, and they also ground powder for the garrison, gunpowder for the garrison. If you held the island, then you held the approaches to Newark. You hold the approaches to Newark, then eventually it's going to fall.
It was obvious that, faced with such overwhelming odds, Newark could not expect to hold out, and it seemed only a matter of time before the town would fall into parliamentarian hands. The one realistic hope of salvation lay outside the defences of the besieged town, and it came in the person of Prince Rupert of the Rhine. Prince Rupert was the young nephew of King Charles. Appointed as General of the Horse in 1642, aged only 23, he came to epitomize the image of the dashing Civil War cavalier. But how had the prince come to such an influential position at such a tender age?
He was influential within the Stuart household, but above and beyond everything else, of course, he was a very experienced professional soldier. He picked up his experiences, his military experiences fighting in the Low Countries. He understood, particularly artillery. People always think of him as a cavalry commander, which he was, but he understood the effect of gunfire and how it could be used, and he fully understood the impact of relatively small numbers of cavalry applied at precisely the right moment of the battle. That's why he was so influential. And at the age in his early 20s as he was experienced beyond his years, and he had influence at court.
Prince Rupert proved to be a fine if flawed cavalry commander and a loyal servant of the king. Prompted by appeals from the royalist commander Lord Loughborough, Rupert marched from the West Country to join forces with Loughborough's own troops to make up an army of more than 6,000 men. They arrived at Bingham, only a short march from Newark, on March the 20th, and it was only then that the parliamentarians became aware that Rupert was even in the area. The news that the prince was on his way to Newark must have come as a very nasty shock indeed to the parliamentarian army, particularly as Rupert had placed his forces across the road to Lincoln, the obvious route for any parliamentarian retreat. On March the 21st, Prince Rupert's forces swept down from the top of nearby Beacon Hill.
He, realising the importance of Newark, rapidly marched across through Leicestershire to the town of Bingham, which is 10 miles to the south of Newark. He then charged down Beacon Hill, which is the main entry to the town from the east, surprising Meldrum, who wasn't really fully appraised of the situation. And in the ensuing battle, joining with the townsfolk, succeeded in evicting him from his positions on the island and around the town.
It was a short, sharp, but decisive action. Rupert's cavalry smashed into the parliamentarian ranks, spreading panic and confusion. They quickly turned and fled. While the royalist horse was winning its victory, troops under Sir Richard Byron attacked the island, and there too the parliamentarians were routed. There had been the most dramatic transformation, and they had little alternative but to concede defeat and surrender. But this presented the royalists with another very real problem. Newark was simply in no position to receive such large numbers of prisoners. And so there was little option but to let the parliamentarian army march ignominiously away, no doubt nursing its battered pride. The royalists, on the other hand, gleefully seized the parliamentarian weapons, an impressive haul that included 11 cannon, 2 mortars, and no fewer than 3,000 muskets. The events at Newark sent shockwaves through the local parliamentarian armies, who reacted with panic, particularly at Lincoln, which was abandoned by the garrison there. What would have been the effect had Rupert stayed on to attack here, or at Derby, or at Nottingham? We will never know, for Rupert chose to return to the West Country, leaving Loughborough to face the inevitable parliamentarian backlash. Meanwhile, in Newark itself, Sir Richard Byron, realizing that the unexpected victory had provided only temporary relief, set about the task of strengthening the town defences. As part of this urgent work, 2 great earthworks were constructed, named, perhaps not surprisingly, the King's Sconce and the Queen's Sconce. Unfortunately, the King's Sconce was destroyed in 1887, but the Queen's Sconce survives to this day, one of the best preserved of all Civil War earthworks. A sconce is a military term for a detached fort with bastions. At Newark, the Royalists mounted cannon on the bastions, which were placed at each corner of the sconce, which also housed an ammunition dump and essential supplies. Because it could be fired on from 3 sides, the ditch that ran around the sconce was a dangerous place for an attacking soldier to find himself, and he would have had to pass through deadly hazards, such as pitfalls, to get there. And a sconce was less vulnerable to cannon fire. A cannonball that struck a castle would do great damage to its walls, whereas it would simply bury itself in the earthen ramparts of a sconce, doing little damage or harm.
A number of small sconces or redoubts were constructed on the island in order to defend strategic parts of the island. In addition, the town had a perimeter outside the existing town, incorporating the medieval town walls on one side and extending them on the other. The perimeter was eventually fortified in a similar way as a sconce, but in a linear form with bastions at intervals and at strategic points, such as Coddington Lane.
By the middle of 1644, however, the tide of the war had turned against the king and the royalist cause. Troops from the Newark garrison were here at Marston Moor during the decisive battle fought in July that year, which saw the royalist armies crushed by an allied parliamentarian and Scots force. In October 1644, another royalist field army was defeated at Belvoir, a debacle that paved the way for the removal as governor of Sir Richard Byron, the man held responsible. Colonel Sir Richard Willis, a veteran of Civil War battles as far back as Edge Hill in 1642, replaced him as the 3rd governor of Newark. The royalist position continued to worsen during 1645. On the 14th of June came the calamitous defeat at Naseby, which destroyed the king's main field army and ended all hopes of an overall royalist victory. Even the usually optimistic Charles seems to have accepted the inevitability of defeat, although a letter written to Prince Rupert after Naseby displays his trademark stubbornness and absolute belief in the justness of his cause. I must say there is no probability but of my ruin, but as a Christian I must tell you that God will not suffer rebels to prosper, or his cause to be overthrown. I know my obligations to be in both conscience and honour neither to abandon God's cause, nor injure my successors, nor forsake my friends. Newark was now an isolated royalist stronghold, surrounded by parliamentarian enemies. King Charles paid a final visit to Newark in October 1645. It was to prove a momentous visit, for it was here, at the 15th century governor's house, now a busy modern cafe, that the king had a fierce argument with his reckless but loyal nephew, Prince Rupert. The pair quarrelled bitterly over a number of issues. The prince's surrender of the port of Bristol in September, about which the king was absolutely furious, was just one. Another was the behaviour of Sir Richard Willis, whom the prince strongly supported, but who the king was determined to remove. Yet another was the general conduct of the war by the royalist side.
Rupert was extremely reluctant to be tied down in essentially a defensive action. And there was a professional disagreement, which we know about, and I have absolutely no doubt, a personal disagreement, about influence at court and really where Rupert's future lay inside the royal household. Some suggest that Rupert saw the problem much more clearly than the king by this stage, and saw that unless his forces were used to manoeuvre, and where he could use his troops to take on parliamentarian forces before they had time to concentrate, that really the Stuart cause was going to be lost. The king didn't see it that way and wanted to keep this crucially important force in and around the area of Newark. They fell out, and in due course Rupert departed, and of course probably proved to be the more correct of the two.
The prince was obviously unable to calm his uncle's anger, for it was not long after that he received a letter from the king banishing him into exile. "You assured me that if no mutiny happened, you would keep Bristol for 4 months. Did you keep it 4 days? Was there anything like a mutiny? More questions might be asked, but now I confess to little purpose. My conclusion is to desire you to seek your subsistence somewhere beyond seas, until it shall please God to determine of my condition." It was in truth a shabby way to treat a loyal servant of the king's cause. It was therefore at this house in Newark that the king and his nephew were to meet for the very last time. But Prince Rupert was not the only object of the king's wrath. Accused of misappropriating military funds, Sir Richard Willis was relieved of his duties and sent from the town.
Third governor of Newark, of course, during the siege, friend of Rupert's, and the fact that he had led apparently a particularly flamboyant and wasteful lifestyle here inside the town. He continued to give parties. He even gave a ball at one stage and a number of banquets, whilst allegedly the local people, the Newarkers, actually starved to death, maybe. Fact remains that he had clearly lost the confidence of the townspeople and the garrison of Newark, and Charles was made aware of that when he moved into residence here.
All of which left yet another new governor, Sir John Bellasyse, to see Newark through its third and longest siege, which began on the 26th of November, 1645. Surrounded by parliamentarian forces, the prospects for the town once again looked very bleak indeed. This time the parliamentarians were determined to leave little to chance, and they set about constructing 2 lines of circumvallation that eventually surrounded the town. These were designed not only to prevent an escape from within, but also to guard against another Prince Rupert-like rescue act from without.
During the third siege, the Scots rapidly occupied the island and succeeded in setting up camp there. This meant that the townspeople and its garrison were denied access to the island and its provisions. Also, steps were taken to completely surround the town, and a line of circumvallation was constructed from Farndon in the southwest to Winthorpe in the northeast, so that the town was entirely cut off from the outside world. They also attempted to dam the rivers so that the town's mills, powder mills, flour mills, sawmills, would all be cut off from water supply, in addition to which, of course, drinking water would be in shorter supply. So things were getting pretty difficult.
To meet the coming parliamentarian attack, Bellasyse had ordered yet more improvements to the town's defences. He had been unimpressed with what he had found on his arrival. Slight and lying open had been his verdict on the defensive earthworks. But within a few weeks, all that had changed. Soon he was able to boast that deep gaffs, bastions, horns, half-moons, counterscarps, redoubts, pitfalls, an impregnable line of sod and turf palisades meant that this bulky bulwark of Newark presented to the besiegers but one entire sconce. Bellasyse also turned his attention to pressing matters inside the town. One vital necessity in short supply was money, but Bellasyse was undaunted. If money was running out, he reckoned, then Newark would mint its own. And so a mint was established in the castle to produce coins for the town. Many of these siege pieces survive today, remarkable symbols of the town's defiance and powerful reminders of a turbulent period in Newark's long history.
We're very lucky that we have things called Newark siege pieces, which are lozenge-shaped bits of silver and sometimes pewter, which are actually cut out of the plate that belonged to many of the local residents and some of the more prosperous businessmen. The plate was taken and either, I say, directly cut or melted down, and then these siege pieces produced in varying different values to say to not just the people of Newark but to the surrounding area, the King's rule is still very much in evidence here. That's why he's striking money. That's why money is being minted with his name, his crown, his cipher here on the coinage. So the idea of saying to the prosperous people around Newark, right, let's have your goods and your chattels and your valuables, let's bring them in and let's mint fresh money. It was as much a morale factor as it was a physical factor.
Twice before, the parliamentarians had tried to take Newark, and twice they had failed. But during the third siege of the town, they had other allies to help them gain their objective. But these allies were not armed with a musket or a sword. These were unseen, but just as deadly. They were hunger and disease.
During the last siege, I think conditions in Newark must have been pretty horrible. There was very little food. They were reduced to eating almost anything they could get hold of. Rats, horses, though only if the horse was old and not able to fight. Also, plague had broken out in the town. So that, of course, meant that the people were weak and couldn't really have held out for very much longer than they already had to.
The chroniclers tell us it was a town of great pestilence and sickness, with people scurrying around in fear and trembling all the time. I think things were pretty serious. We know that bread ran short. We know that any horse, of course, or mule or oxen or anything like that was knocked down, immediately ended up being eaten by the residents of the town. But I don't think we ever got to the stage quite as, say, the Paris siege of 1870, where rats became a delicacy. Nothing like that. It's interesting, of course, that when the king surrendered finally out at Southwell, at the Saracens' Head at Southwell, that when orders came back to the town that they should surrender as well, you would think that a town in such a parlous state would say, well, thank God for that, we can chuck our hands in. But not a bit of it. Of course, the mayor said, no, trust God and sally forth. Deo fratus irumpe, the motto of Newark today, which doesn't suggest to me that the morale was very badly dented, despite the fact that things were far from pleasant in the town.
To add to the miseries of the townspeople, in March 1646, the dreaded plague broke out, the inevitable consequence of the overcrowded and insanitary conditions. Owing to the parliamentarian blockade, it was almost impossible to properly dispose of the dead, which are said to have been more than 200 in number. And all the while, the parliamentarian attacks continued. Cannon shot from no fewer than 23 artillery pieces positioned in the lines of circumvallation poured down into the town. At the end of March, a summons was issued to Bellasyse demanding that Newark surrender. It left little doubt as to what would happen to the townsfolk if they failed to take the opportunity. We, the Committee of both Kingdoms, being sent and authorized to use our best endeavors for the reducing of the town and garrison of Newark, do hereby demand of you that you surrender the same. It is the pious care of the Parliament to prevent the effusion of Christian blood, the wasting of the country, and the destruction of towns. We sent no summons until you and all with you might see we were able by force to attain what we much rather desire by treaty. We have 16,000 horse and foot at present before your town, soldiers of experience, united in health and courage. Flatter not yourselves. Relief is not to be had. Consider these things seriously, for you cannot but see your ruin to be inevitable. We expect your answer on Monday by 11 of the clock in the forenoon at Balderton. It took Belisarius 3 days to get around to replying, and when he did, it was merely to say that he needed to receive his orders from the king, and may he send out to get them. If you will grant a pass to some gentleman to go to the king and return, I may know his majesty's pleasure, whether, according to his letter, he will wind up the business in general, or leave me to steer my own course. In the event, there was no surrender to the parliamentarians, and no treaty was signed. The bombardment continued, and the people of Newark grew hungrier and sicker. But on the 5th of May 1646 came news that rendered further resistance from Newark futile. Nearly 6 weeks after the surrender of the last Royalist field army, during which time he had wandered aimlessly as a fugitive in his own country, King Charles surrendered himself to the Scots army at Southwell. This is the very room in which King Charles spent his last night of freedom. Today it is a room in the Saracen's Head Hotel in Southwell, but it is not difficult to imagine the scene on that night in May, 350 years ago, when, after consulting with his lieutenants and councillors, the troubled fugitive king finally decided that all was lost. What must the king's feelings have been, as, after all he and his supporters had gone through, he prepared to hand himself over to the Scots? What was Newark to do? Neither governor nor townsfolk were prepared to give in, and it is said that plans were laid for a fighting escape through the parliamentarian ranks. In the end, discretion perhaps proved the better part of valour, and Belisarius decided to write to the king to ask for guidance. For the parliamentarians, the letter was a gift from heaven. They forced their new royal prisoner to order the town to capitulate. The king wrote, "Belisarius, such is the condition of affairs at this present that I can give you no hope of relief. Wherefore the best for my service will be that you conclude upon them with all expedition. The chief reason is that according to my design, I am necessitated to march with the Scots army this day northwards, but cannot move till this agreement be consented to by you. I am heartily sorry that my business stands so as that I must impose conditions upon you." The letter was proof positive of the king's dire and parlous condition, and it left Belisarius with little choice. Even so, some were for ignoring the order and carrying on. The town's mayor was one. He is said to have urged Belisarius to trust in God and sally forth. Deo fratus erumpe. The Latin translation of that memorable phrase has been Newark's motto ever since. Despite this bravado, Belisarius knew that there was only one realistic course of action. He signed the terms of surrender on the 8th of May 1646, with, it is said, tears in his eyes. The third and final siege of Newark was ended. Its war was over. So, in all but name, was the Great English Revolution.
And that's when, in order to make sure that Newark never again, in the fluid situation of a civil war, never again became influential from the Royalist point of view, that's when the parliamentarians ordered the townspeople of Newark to reduce the castle. And a lot of the damage that you see done to the castle looks as if it might be warlike damage, but actually was deliberate demolishing by the people of Newark on the orders of the victorious parliamentarians.
Perhaps out of pity or grudging admiration for the town's valour, the terms imposed on Newark by the parliamentarians were not particularly harsh, nor were there terrible acts of revenge, as had been the case in the aftermath of other sieges.
The aftermath of the siege in Newark does not seem to have been quite so terrible as some other instances. We have to remember that it was a civil war, and so there would be people from the same families on both sides. So maybe it wasn't the thing to be so bad, because you were going to have to live together. Also, people would be very anxious to get back to their homes and farms. So whilst they were ordered to generally sack the town and make it defenceless, it would seem that the demolition, the slighting of the castle was rather half-hearted. A few things were done as acts of religious zeal by the Puritans in the church, such as the destruction of the font and the removal of brasses. But apart from that, things got back to normal again very, very quickly. The font was repaired in 1660, and 50 years later, very fine houses were being built in the town. So clearly the effects were not quite as devastating as one might think.
On the 8th of May 1646, Lord John Bellasyse, the fourth and final governor of Newark, was allowed to march proudly out of the town with what remained of his royalist army, an army that now numbered only some 1,500 men. Noblemen and gentlemen were permitted to keep not only their servants, but also their weapons and horses. All that was asked in return was that they should never again take up arms against Parliament. The safety of the townspeople of Newark and the preservation of their goods and estates was guaranteed. As for King Charles, he had hoped salvation might be found among his fellow Scots, but it was not to be. Their price for helping him regain his lost throne was the establishment of the Presbyterian Church in England, a price that Charles steadfastly refused to pay. Perhaps a more pragmatic king might have agreed. The Church of England been sacrificed, and English history very different indeed. Even in these difficult circumstances, King Charles refused to yield to the Scots' demands. As it was, the Scots gave up trying. In January 1647, they reached a settlement that rewarded Scottish Army war services and handed the king over to Parliament, paving the way for the drama of his trial at Westminster Hall in London. The trial began on January the 20th, 1649, and it may have been the king's finest hour. Speaking in his own defense, the stammer with which he had been blighted all of his life somehow disappeared, and he made his case clearly and eloquently. I would know by what power I am called hither. I would know by what authority, I mean lawful. There are many unlawful authorities in the world, thieves and robbers by the highway. Remember, I am your king, your lawful king, and what sins you bring upon your heads, and the judgment of God on this land. But the die was cast. Despite the power of his argument, the king was found to be a tyrant, a traitor, a murderer, and a public enemy to the Commonwealth of England. He was sentenced to die by the severing of his head from his body. The final act in the tragedy of the English Civil War came 2.5 years after the surrender of Newark, on the 30th of January 1649, when King Charles, in freezing weather, climbed a scaffold outside the banqueting hall in London, knelt at the block, and the executioner cut off his head with, in Oliver Cromwell's chilling words, the crown upon it. It was a brutal end to one of the saddest episodes in English history. It is said that when the axe fell, a great groan came from the assembled crowd. That groan surely echoed across the land, to be heard in towns such as Newark, which had stood steadfastly behind the king, had fought for his cause, and which had never fallen in battle to his enemies. Today, many of the people that live and work in modern-day Newark probably find it impossible to imagine the drama that unfolded in their town when it fought for the king's cause all those centuries ago. But Newark reveres its remarkable history and cherishes still the visible testimonies to its defiance during the dark days of the English Civil War.